At our last Luce MacDowell conversation, we focused on photography and memory. Is anyone here for that discussion? Yeah, a couple of people. Great, wonderful. As I've been thinking about that conversation, I keep coming back to storytelling and to the complex and myriad ways that stories are at once embedded in photographs and at the same time embed photographs within themselves. Put another way, stories are not just straightforwardly told by images and sounds, by novelists, by playwrights, by historians and politicians. They also tell us, stories tell us, they give us the frameworks within which we make and tell new stories. So I wanted to start by asking each of you, if you can, maybe in reflecting on that question, tell us a little bit about your work. Each of you in different ways, I think, is trying to disrupt those frameworks within which we understand stories and understand ourselves. You're trying to push against some of those limitations. So tell us about some of the new stories that you are helping to tell and about how your work, in your view, changes how we hear and understand stories. So maybe we'll go all the way to the end and start with Samora and come back down the row.
Sure, thanks. It's wonderful to see everybody. Nice to meet you. And, an honor to be here with all of you. Well, with the Healing Project, we're an organization, arts organization that creates healing rooms, artistic projects, and advocacy initiatives in partnership with people who have been directly impacted by the prison industrial complex and what I call the before, during, and after of the carceral system. So we work with currently incarcerated artists, but we also work with returning citizens and immigrants who have dealt with the detention system. And we also work with youth who have been, dealt with the youth detention system or even what we call social determinants of health, right? At base level for me, I endeavored to create the Healing Project because I was really interested in, as a starting point, number one, prevention. And for me, a huge part of prevention, it revolves around healing. Of course, we know that there are a myriad of traumas that people are dealing with, but oftentimes racial capitalism is the primary determinant between whether you get to engage in healing processes or be punished for your trauma. On the one hand, I think we try to engage with what I would term an inside-out kind of set of practices, both in terms of how we actually work, which is that we do not work with the carceral system. So we actually have to work with our artists by jumping across the prison walls. And that involves a myriad of practices. And I think that also really informs why the work is what it is artistically, and the way in which we're able to empower the artists that we work with to tell stories unfiltered. It also, I think, has to do with the kind of feedback system in which we work, which is about, I think, for me, what I call flipping the script. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when it comes to audiences engaging in work that is being made or presented by incarcerated artists or even people who have dealt with structural violence in general, there is a power dynamic in which audiences unconsciously are seeing themselves as above and are thinking about what can we learn about the system or how can we have pity on people or, with the best of intentions. But just because that is the dynamic in which our stories have constantly been told. And for us, we're much more interested in what do you actually need to learn from people, right? And so we make work that's about the grieving process. We make work that's about dealing with mental health issues, things that everybody deals with, but the artists who are telling you the tools that you need for your life are incarcerated artists.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's not just about what stories we're telling, but it's about how we're telling them, who's telling them, how empowered are they to own their own stories, and how courageous are they allowed to be while being protected? Because obviously a lot of artists are also under surveillance, under, what's the word? Now, like, what, you know, when you can't say the things that you want to say. Yeah, so those are the things that we're interested in doing and that we're trying to do constantly. Yeah.
I co-founded Prison Journalism Project, which trains incarcerated writers to be journalists, to do journalism, and we publish their stories. We got our start literally the first days of COVID, and my co-founder and I were teaching inside prisons, and immediately we couldn't get in. We weren't hearing from our students. We didn't know how they were doing, and some of the sites of the worst outbreaks were inside prisons. In particular, I was at San Quentin, where I think the rate of people who ended up with COVID was over 85%. And it was just a moment where it was really clear that you can't understand the whole story without the perspectives of all the people, all the perspectives. And if you can't understand it, you're not going to, you can't build a better system. You can't have a more thoughtful system, et cetera. And so, we think about the almost 2 million people who are incarcerated. The half of this country's population has or has had a person who has a family member or a relative who's been inside, who has been incarcerated, and so it shouldn't be stigmatized as much as it is, and we see our writers as absolutely part of the communities that the broader communities, and we center our work around the writers. We live in a space that we think of as lived experience journalism. So all of the stories that we publish are by people who are directly impacted, and we do journalism, which means our writers do all kinds of other work as well. But with us, they want to write with impact. They want to reach audiences, and so our editors work with them over many drafts to publish stories that shed light on life in prison. Sometimes it's more op-edish. They have something that they want to say, but it's rooted mostly in observation and interviews and their own experiences. And it's really amazing how compelling those stories can be. And how much credibility and integrity they can bring, and especially today where journalists and media are under so much scrutiny. In an interesting way, I think the stories that our writers tell, where they're saying, this is my experience, has more resonance, and they really connect.
Jeanelle.
Hi, I'm Jeanelle, and I am a co-founder of Rise and Remember. Rise and Remember exists to conserve and preserve stories of resistance to racial injustice and to curate spaces for people to grieve, pay respect, and be a voice for justice. My co-founders are George Floyd's aunt and first cousin, Miss Angela Harrison and Kara Stevens, and our work really centers around the memorial to George Floyd and preserving the protest art that people marched in the streets in a moment of urgency during 2020. Y'all remember it was like COVID, and then Black people were being lynched, and then people took to the streets all over the world, truly. And many people would come to George Floyd Square, the place where he took his last breath, and laid down an offering. My background is in theology, and so we made it all theology-ish. They would lay down an offering, or theological, probably would have been the better term, and we would care for it and preserve it. And as neighbors, so I live just a couple blocks away, and as neighbors, we would say that everything is somebody's offering, therefore nothing is thrown away. And two, that the people are more sacred than the memorial itself. We are people over property all day, every day. And the reason why we came up with those core values is because we understood that we are in this fight against racism. And so when it comes to stories, racism has historically worked to disremember and misremember story. By design, so that way it could continue to live and it could continue to thrive. And so we had to intentionally work to help people remember the truth and remember the stories that people have. So we're not actually preserving and caring for new stories, we're preserving and caring for old stories, stories that have been suppressed, stories that are not allowed to be told because it doesn't bid well for the news and for the media. There's been so many families that would come and they would ask, can the name of my loved one be added to our memorial? Can the name of my loved one be added to the Saint Ernest installation? And I'll say this and I'll close, but my extended family had a family reunion. So it was like my cousin's cousins, like the other side of the family. And they had a family reunion in Minnesota. And they came to George Floyd Square and they said, Jeanelle, will you host us? And will you give us a pilgrimage through George Floyd Square, which is about 2 blocks by 2 blocks of protest art, large and small. And I said yes, and I walked them through. And then one of our relatives came up to me and said, you know, we have a loved one in Florida that was taken by police. Can we add their name to the memorial? I literally handed them a Sharpie and said, go for it. And they went to one of the Jersey barriers that was put up for safety by the city of Minneapolis, and they added the name of their loved one. And so George Floyd Square is a place where stories are being preserved that are not new stories, but old stories, so that we can end lynchings in America.
Yeah. I would love for the folks who are here to hear you all tell some of the stories that you've heard or experienced, either your own or others. Can you tell us a story? You've just told us one about your family, but I'd love to hear another one if you have one. But can you tell us a story that you think exemplifies the kind of this transformative power of telling stories that I think we're starting to talk about?
In 2020, so again, my background's theology. I started doing racial justice work 2 decades ago, and I had started my own company called Racial Agency Initiative to do racial justice leadership coaching. When George Floyd was lynched, my family had called me. At the time, I was living in Texas to heal and recover from burnout. And they called me and they said, Jeanelle, will you come and do your work here? And I said, no. And then they reached out to me again. They said, please. And it was probably day 2 of the uprising. And so I said, okay. And I flew home on May 29th. And I decided the way I would get involved in the protests. Well, I first started joining the protests, and then the tear gas and the rubber bullets came and triggered all my trauma. And I was like, you know, this is why I was resting. And so on June 1st of 2020, I decided that every morning, because I'm a morning person, I would wake up and I would tend to the memorial. And because I own my own company, I own my own time. And so I started giving my time to the memorial and caring for it 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day. The mornings were best because no one was there, but every morning the memorial looked different because it was COVID and the extroverts had no place to go except for George Floyd Square. And at night, the extroverts would extrovert and they would do all their things. And then I would get up in the morning in my introverted self and tend to the space. But one particular morning, there was a middle-aged white man who was watching me carry buckets of water. I would carry about 10 gallons of water halfway up the block. I would start at Satul, and then I would work my way to the memorial to water all the plants that people were laying as live offerings. And he came up and he informed me of how much water weighed. And he said, did you know? I said, I had no idea. I'm just doing the work. And he's like, can I help you? I said, yes, you may help me. And he helped me carry these buckets of water up to the heart of the memorial, and we started watering the plants. And when we finished watering the plants, he stood there quiet. And I looked at him, And I knew something was wrong because he had a visitor's badge on his sweater, and I knew it was from the hospital. And I just walked up to him and said, you know, whatever it is that you're going through, the square is big enough to hold it all. And he began to tell me that his mother had just passed away. In January, his son was at the hospital under the knife at that very moment, and he was just going through it. And then he says, but nothing is compared to what has happened here to George Floyd. And in that moment, I realized, like, in his white-bodied self was trying to figure out, how do I balance the fact that I'm going through a very difficult time in life, but I'm also facing this very real racial reality that we're navigating as a society. And I don't want to put my pain before the pain of this unjust lynching, and I don't know what to do with all of that. And that created an opportunity in space for me as a black-bodied woman to be able to say, you know, this space of public grief, because we don't do public grief well in America. We don't have spaces where people can just cry without someone looking at you funny, like, what's going on? But to know that the people, in response to an injustice, created a space where anybody could go and lay their burdens down. And that we could share that with this person to say, yes, this is a space where we remember George Floyd and all stolen lives, but this is also a space where you can remember your mother. This is also a space where you can remember your son, that you can offer your prayers, that you can offer your hopes, where you can offer your imagination and your possibilities of what you want. Because, and we say this in George Floyd Square, that Black liberation is for the liberation of us all. Mm-hmm. And so we hold that to be true, in that just because we're here, or it was created to remember Black lives and Black bodies, it's also an invitation for all of us to be free and to be liberated. So that's another story I wanted to share.
That's a great story. Yukari?
Yeah, you know, we, as I mentioned, we got our start right at the beginning of COVID, which also means that George Floyd was killed 2 months later, and that really fueled the stories. We didn't actually have to ask for stories about it because they just changed. And I think about those first couple of years and how the stories transformed me and really shaped what Prison Journalism Project is now. Because, you know, when he was killed, we got stories saying, you know, I am George Floyd, I was George Floyd, and those stories, of course, were extremely powerful. But the real moment of transformation that I think of is a year later when Derek Chauvin got sentenced to 22 and a half years. And we asked for, in journalism, we one of the things we do is, you would call them vox pops, but asking people what they thought, right? And in that moment, journalists everywhere were asking people in the community what they thought. And we also asked our writers at the time to find out what people were saying inside their facilities. And, you know, you got some of the same stuff. You know, people were elated, they were relieved, they were still angry. But we also saw compassion that we didn't see expressed in the media outside, where they were, you know, they said, you know, he's gonna get solitary, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And that just blew my mind, you know, that there was compassion and it was being reported nowhere else, right? And so that was the first moment when I thought, you know, we have a role to play. And then came the stories about the sentence itself, 22 and a half years. You know, our writers speculate, well, that means that, you know, he'll probably serve 15 years. And these are writers, many of them are incarcerated for decades. And they're saying, you know, I could do 15 years in my sleep. I've done 30, and we just collected stories about what 22 and a half years meant to them. And another moment, right, where it's stories that can never be written from anybody outside, and so that's really shaped our values and ethos and the way we help tell the stories. And I brought my phone because I just wanted to read you the headlines from what's on our homepage right now and just show you why our stories are transformative. And I'll just read them. The first is Why I Make Burial Urns from Prison for Veterans. Zen and the Art of a Prison Routine. In prison, we have less medical privacy. How one man earned a PhD in prison. Sometimes I feel like I'm in prison more than he is. You know, very, very different, right? But each piece has somewhere to fit in our collective understanding.
I think oftentimes when we're engaging in necessary practices of urgency, we don't necessarily know where to put spirit. So I think that's just a very profound thing. So much respect. But I think the thing I was thinking about when you asked that question, I've been working for about 5 years now. One of our most amazing incarcerated artists, his name is Keith Lamar. Keith Lamar is on death row in Ohio. He was framed for the largest riot in Ohio history. Everybody in the state, it's an open secret. They know that he was, framed. And he was scheduled to be executed last year. We were able to delay that, and we're now working towards his exoneration. And he's an amazing writer, teacher. He teaches middle school, high school classes, all from death row. Painter, incredible. So we've done a bunch of different projects with Keith. And as a part of that set of projects, as I said, because we don't go through traditional systemic frameworks with the prison, a lot of our artistic projects start on the phone and with phone calls. And in general, I think correspondence, it's like the major thing. And if anybody, just as an aside, is looking for the place to start in regards to dealing with and trying to help out in terms of direct support to incarcerated people, start with correspondence. Don't end with correspondence, because there's also many other things to deal with and certainly to fight for on a systemic level. But, correspondence is a beautiful place to start because it is the lifeline for people inside. So anyways, we're on a call, and I try to always be in the practice of thinking about what are the questions that I can ask that people don't usually ask you. Like in general, I'm interested in that because I feel like 99% of what we say, we've kind of already prepared it. Yeah. I actually I didn't steal it, but I was given that by my mentor, Anna DeVere Smith, who's like the master at asking questions. So anyways, I asked him, what is one thing about you that nobody has ever asked you about? No, sorry, I'm wrong. I said, what is one characteristic of yours that nobody's ever asked you about? And he said, my sweetness. And I was like, okay, we're gonna talk about that. And so he proceeded to speak to that. And luckily I was, with his partnership recording that conversation that we were having. And he spoke about his sweetness, his tenderness. He spoke about how there was no space for that in the system, and yet he was able to engage in those vulnerable practices through correspondence, through relationships, through mutual networks of support, through creative practice, through chess, all kind of stuff. And he also spoke about how he was very conscious of the fact that the state was not just trying to put him to death just because of who he was. The state was trying to make an example of him. And not just because he was resistant to the state in the ways that the things he talked about, but also because of that very sweetness, yeah. Right? And I think that goes back to the spiritual element in terms of when we talk about dealing with white supremacy on a systemic level, it's not just an attack on our rights. It's also kind of a death cult. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, anyways, that was a piece that we recorded. We actually took that audio call and we created a song out of it, which actually you can find if you search. It's called Keith Lamar and then colon Sweet. That piece was entirely made just from the phone call and string quartet. All the noises on it are the noises from the phone call, which we transformed into different things. We took the nice, sweet, like they make the voice that interrupts you on the phone, you know, that GTL is making all kind of money. They make it like a woman. They make it like a sweet lady's voice, like call service. Like they're trying to trick you that it's nice. So we turned it to a robot voice, right? So there's all kind of subtle things that we're trying to do sonically to really like engage in what that is. So that's what I think about.
I mean, these are really powerful stories and transformative for me just listening to them. But I want to shift gears a little bit because I think we've been talking about stories in a sense as kind of liberatory, but they can also be frightening, threatening. I think communities hide from certain kinds of stories. They also live inside certain stories that they can't get out of. Now, sometimes something happens and that story that people live inside kind of breaks open and it doesn't work anymore. And I think the murder of George Floyd was like that. It forced a lot of folks, especially white folks, I think, to pay attention to some stories that they were hiding from. And for a while, it seemed to a lot of us like that story that white people especially were living inside and forcing folks of color to live inside was going to be disrupted. But we didn't know what happened, or one of the things that happened. I think fear and resentment reasserted themselves. A lot of people decided it was easier to look backward than to look forward. And I think, I think that moment of possibility is still there, but we missed something, right? We missed an opportunity, I think, some of us. What went wrong at that moment? And can we get back to that moment of possibility, if you agree that it was a moment of possibility?
We have to remember that, again, I started with racism exists in misremember and disremember story. This capitalistic society thrives on our ability to forget. Our ability to forget how much we just paid for that iPhone 17, so that when the iPhone 18 comes out, we're going to buy that one. Our ability to forget is so necessary for racism to exist and persist. And it wasn't just George Floyd that was forgotten, right? Sandra Bland was forgotten. Philando Castile was forgotten. Trayvon Martin was forgotten. Emmett Till was forgotten. Like we can go far back into history and we see that people are forgotten, these stories are forgotten so that way the system can thrive. And even this day, y'all, Minneapolis has been going through it. I know y'all have been seeing us on the news, and yes, it's as bad as it sounded. And we are looking at the fact that we have had neighbors kidnapped from us, thousands of neighbors kidnapped from us. And we had two neighbors whose lives were taken. Renee Good, 4 blocks away from my house, and Alex Preddy about 5 minutes away from my house. And George Floyd was 2 blocks away from my house. So the government is stealing our lives. And I pray that the thousands of people that took to the street to protest because of ICE, because of the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, doesn't become yet another moment where the weather gets good and we forget. We forget why we marched. We forget that we were standing for democracy. We forget, even now. So I'm running for office in Minnesota, and I went to someone else's launch party, and there was a group of folks talking, and I'm running against an incumbent, and that group of folks said, anyone who's running against a progressive incumbent should be punished. And I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I held my tongue. But if I had said something in that moment, I was thinking as if being a Black woman in America is not punishment enough. And for you to attempt to discourage me from living out my right to run for office, is this a democracy or a democratic republic, or is it not? Were we not just marching and getting tear gassed and rubber bulleted by the Department of Homeland Security police to say we want a democracy, and yet you are going to turn around and try to silence my voice? Like, but that's the system, right? And that is how we forget, and we go back into the same thing that we have been doing over and over and over again. So we, as Americans, we have to make a choice to remember. We have to make a choice to have, in the Black culture, Black community, we have this word called Sankofa, which is all about making sure that we look back to see where we've been so we can understand where we are going. If we don't collectively, in all of our diversity, embrace that kind of spirit where we refuse to forget what led to the deaths of our neighbors, we refuse to forget what led to the kidnapping of our neighbors, we refuse to forget what led to the incarceration of our neighbors, then and only then can we start to build a more better home and place for us to live together in unity. But we have to make that choice, and we can't rely on the systems because the system is designed for us to forget.
You know, we started in April 2020. It's April 2026, 6 years. We've published 2,600 stories and counting. We're the largest publisher of writing from inside prisons. And I feel, I feel enormous responsibility about that, and to make sure that the stories live on and continue to live. And I guess to answer the second half of your question, Sean, I mean, it's, I'm encouraged. It gives me hope that we continue to exist, that we have funders and donors, that there are readers. I mean, in some, the act of not forgetting is through reading a story, right? And knowing and not letting the narrative be misremembered or forgotten. And so some of the work that we're doing right now is thinking about, like how do we present our collection in a way that shows the whole journey of what it's like to be in the system, and how do we make sure that the stories are continuing to be read and understood through the age of AI. And I do believe that when already any variation of the question, what is life in prison like, our stories come up at the top. And so that going forward too, because it's lived experience based, because people are writing, this is what I've experienced, that they will continue to come up in any variation of that question.
We're maybe a little bit afraid of the rupture. And what I mean by that is, like when there's a break, there's a chance for that, like when the dam is broken, the water wants to go full out. And I think a lot of people are afraid of where it will spill, instead of being excited about how much water can get free. You know what I mean? I think we have seen this with people's, reaction to the Palestinian struggle. I think we've seen it. We certainly saw it in 2020. We're seeing it now in many different ways. I think that we saw it in this city. Luckily, it didn't go the same way, but with the election of our mayor and how scared people got about it. Yeah. That was obviously a very hopeful example where I think people saw that actually we could find something very tangible inside of that rupture. And also I think a lot of coalitions, you were talking about, it's in essence coalition, but a lot of coalitions came together around that mayoral race in a way that I think if we can bottle that and engage in those set of practices in all kind of different ways, we have a lot of power, because there were people coming together that maybe around certain issues normally would really be against each other, but really saw a lot of mutual benefit. And as a result, there are some real tangible wins already coming out of that. So I think that's one, in terms of just like really, ideally us really being able to not put a cap on that rupture when it begins, and really try to lean into it. I think another has to do with reform. I think that it's not that I'm against all reforms, but I will say that, again, oftentimes what happens when it's like, wow, there's a possibility for us to really make a true structural change in a certain circumstance. Again, people get scared, especially people in power, and they think, what's the least we can give people so they'll be happy? And unfortunately, a lot of times it works. And I tend to actually see the court system as a part of that. You mentioned conviction, I think the fact that we oftentimes get happy with the conviction of individual police officers for police violence, not, regardless of how people feel about that specific thing, but I think we can all agree that that will not change systemic police violence, So I think that we have to really work together to expect more than what we're given. And I think a third thing I think about a lot is consistency. And that's maybe the hardest, it's the hardest thing for all of us in all of our lives with anything personal, But it's kind of the same in that what's really tricky, especially because we are in a moment where so much is wrong, we're responding to new crises literally every day. The worst thing that we've ever experienced might be happening, like literally, and then, maybe next day is not, who knows? So obviously we're all living inside of that emergency response system. But I think that one of the tactics around that is that actually we don't have the time to really build something lasting. I would just say that organizing is our biggest tool. And I've been very inspired by Minnesota. I mean, I think part of the reason why you see, the 2020 uprising and the uprisings around the recent ICE issues, both happening in Minnesota, is not just because there were murders there. It's because the organizing was so good that the police response was that much. That's what people miss when they think about, well, people are just going and killing. It's very intentional that they're going to Minnesota, and it's because they're really well organized. So that should tell us not just that we need to protect and support them there, but that everywhere we are, we have to be diligent and consistent in our organizing and just choose stuff and be consistent about it.
Yes.
Well, maybe I'll have one more question among us, and then we'll take a look at some of the questions from the audience. You started, Samora, you actually started us with this, talking about healing. And I think that there is something about this country, maybe not uniquely, but in this country, we are oriented toward judgment and punishment. And healing and forgiveness are maybe interpersonal, right? We can sort of get there interpersonally, but when we think systemically, when we think culturally, it is about judging and punishing. And each of you, I think, is starting with a wish to listen, to understand, and to heal. And can you tell us a little bit about just shifting to storytelling as a kind of healing? And maybe just to reflect on what you think it might take to start to move the culture in this country away from accusation, punishment, to forgiveness and healing. I don't know, maybe some more.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess speaking to the first element, I mean, healing, I see myself, with everything, both with the healing work and with the abolitionists, everything that we do, one of the most wonderful things is we're in an ecosystem, right, with so many other people and organizations and folks doing stuff. So that frees us up to try to do the things that we do very well, but not try to do everything, and healing is it shows up in a million different ways and can look like a million different things. I think our approach has a lot to do, not just with like the what of the stories we tell. I guess it goes back to the why or the how, which is for me, number one, the name of the game is vulnerability. And a lot of that has to do with safety. So, like we cannot be vulnerable if we don't know that we're safe. And so we try to provide really deep, safe spaces for people to be extremely vulnerable together so that they can engage in what tends to also be shared spaces where a lot of people actually have gone through a lot of the same things. And so they also can be supported through a set of processes. So just to take an example, one thing that we do is we do what we call healing rooms. And those are actually facilitated by the Healing Project Choir. We have a choir that ranges in size. But basically what we do is we do free healing rooms where we'll show up kind of anywhere. We'll show up to Cafeteria Reentry Center. We'll show up to the community garden, wherever, often we do it in partnership with other organizations. And we sing with folks, and we bring certain songs that we believe will open that portal to vulnerability. And we engage in that practice collectively together in that space. And we do it like on site where people are already comfortable and feel they own the space, And then after that, we facilitate, circles and conversations. And that is basically like it's the portal for us to be able to actually get into the stuff. And then from there, that actually tends to be the actual like beginning part of when we are actually making work with them. So that happens before we actually make the work, and then you can imagine by then we can really get into the work, So for me, I think that's where it starts with vulnerability. And I forget the second part. Oh, you were saying like how to build a world. Well, that's our mission statement is literally how do we build a world around healing. So just because of time, I'm not going to take up time, but we can talk about it. That's our mission. The one thing I would say is starting to understand accountability in a different way, because I think people see that as very much a binary. They think that either we have a punishment-oriented society or we have no accountability. But we have now 30 years of work by so many people that have built many different frameworks for accountability that also is healing-centered, and also that is oftentimes much more, it's not just healing for the person, it's healing on both sides, both for the person who has been harmed and the person who has harmed somebody who often also has been harmed, you know what I mean? So, but these are the spaces where I truly believe this. If we just took the budgets that we put into prisons and we put it there into those programs, ideally including, our own, but also like ones that really engage on all levels of what people need to thrive, then that's the world that we would have.
Half the work that we do is training because we want to equip our writers with the tools to tell their stories in a way that will be heard and seen, and I think that's healing. And at the same time, if we're asking them to be vulnerable, we want to make sure that the readers are there to receive those stories and to consider the stories with thought. And so, we put a lot of work into audience engagement and building our audience. And I think, Sean and I were talking earlier, and I was saying that the first kind of aha moment with our writers is when you plant the idea that they can be journalists or they are journalists, because all of a sudden they start seeing their experiences in the context in the broader context. And that's very powerful. I mean, it's really like kind of getting a front seat view into why people fear journalism or oppressive countries fear journalism. And the second moment comes when the writer sees the audience. And it takes the audience seeing the writer first before that happens. But when that moment happens, that's the connection that is made, and I think ultimately it's about people in a community in this society connecting to each other through these stories, and that gives me a lot of hope.
So we work with ephemeral objects that we've always believed would help us collectively heal. And at the same time, we also say that we are people of a property. What I've witnessed already is the way that we've been able to leverage and use the memorial offerings as a conduit to help people heal in community with people. Mm-hmm. And it's not just through exhibitions, because those have been very beneficial for that kind of work and community dialogue to take place. But we found that as these offerings have been vandalized, then we would go through like restorative justice processes, and the perpetrator, their responsibility would be to actually restore that which they vandalized. And we've done it a few times now when we know who the perpetrator is. And one person, he actually spray painted over the face of George Floyd on a mural, which is extremely offensive because he already died a violent death. Then to deface his face as a Black man that's meant to remember him is very painful. And when we went through the restorative justice process with this person, and he had to do 6 months of work with us with memorial caretaking. And the very first piece that he was given, and this was not intentional, I literally took a pile of offerings and then I flipped them upside down, and I didn't know what I was giving him, but I said, take the first piece and I want you to spend time with it, and I want you just to observe it. And then he took it, he looked at it, and I said, tell me what it says. And he said, the God I serve is a Black man. And then he started to turn red. And I was like, huh. And it was so fascinating because here this person who defaced the image of a Black man, his first assignment to care for an offering that literally reads, the God I serve is a Black man. And now he has to wrestle with that. Of what did I just do? When someone who wrote this truly believes this, and I deface the image of God. And so that healing work, right, of being able to spend time with other people's stories and other people's imaginations and creative expressions of pain and hope, I think that intimate relationship, connecting somehow with an artist or an author you do not know, somehow brings healing to us, and it connects us. And so, which is why I appreciate what you all are doing, because I want to go and read all the stories. I want to go and listen to the sounds, because that connects me, even with people that I do not know, and maybe will help me on my healing journey and my pursuit of a more just world.
Who are the thinkers, artists, and organizers you mentioned, Anna Demir Smith, who have been sources of guidance for you?
Just the people that come to my mind. I think about Richie Reseda, who's based in LA with Question Culture. Some organizations that I've worked with in New York that I really love and admire are Brotherhood Sister Soul in Harlem, South Bronx Unite in the Bronx, the Fortune Society in Queens, Parole Prep, and also RAP, which is Release Aging People from Prison. I think is that they're both based in Lower, actually kind of near here. Amazing organizations. There's many, but those are the folks that are coming to mind at the moment. And in terms of artists, again, I'm gonna go to underground artists, because that's the people that are really telling the truth right now. So I would point to Tefpo in St. Louis, who was a part of the Ferguson uprising. I think about Saul Williams, and I forgot what was the last category, but there's so many people that I'm forgetting, but I'll stop there. Lord mercy.
Part of what inspired me personally to start what I'm doing now is Nicole Hannah-Jones. And her 1619 project really blew my mind because, as a journalist, you're taught that, you stand outside of the story. That's how you approach it. And she told this story that just deepened my understanding of history through the sharing of her own experiences, her family's experiences, and it really showed me the way to the power of first-person journalism and the fact that it's possible and and even more powerful. She was, her work was a real inspiration. She's an advisor for us. And then I think of, and then for me, I mean, it's kind of like you. I mean, I think about the guys that I've known personally inside, and my co-founder, Shaheen, her inspiration comes from her high school, a very close friend of hers from high school, Tarek Makbul, who's one of our writers, and he's incarcerated in New Jersey for 150 years for a crime that he professes his innocence about, and he was just granted his sentence was commuted recently, but he when he was first sentenced and Shaheen went to see him in his first visit, he told her that, everybody here has a story and you'll never hear about it. And that's the other piece that has really inspired Prison Journalism Project, and together, that's what's behind the work that we do.
And I'll keep mine brief. My entire community inspires me, and I have to say that, or else they'll have my neck. But the one person that I've really anchored to is Harriet Tubman. Mm-hmm. She always would go back and get her people, and kept fighting for liberation and kept fighting for people to be free. And I'm inspired by her story.
The questioner asks, how has the work that you have done connected you to unlikely, surprising individuals or communities?
Sorry, can you say that question again?
How has the work that you do or have done connect you? How has that connected you to unlikely, unexpected individuals, partners, allies, interlocutors? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kick that off. I never thought I would be in the world of cultural heritage preservation, ever. Like my background is theology. I have a degree in intercultural studies, a master's of divinity in Christian ethics. I was not going the road of cultural heritage preservation. And I think being in this space and being able to connect with people and actually work on the intersectionality between racial justice and preserving our stories, that has been a privilege. And I'm blessed to now be in relationship with Black cultural heritage preservationists across the country. And I didn't know how few there were. Like, there are less than 20 Black art conservators in the entire nation. And the closest one to us in Minneapolis is in Indiana. And so I just considered myself privileged. But then also, the most profound phone call I've ever been on was there was another mass shooting that had taken place, and that community had organized for a ton of us to get together who've had major historical moments of loss in our country. And we're on that call, and people started to introduce themselves, and they're saying, "Hi, I'm from Mother Emanuel 9. Hi, I'm from 9/11. Hi, I'm from Sandy Hook. Hi, I'm from Boston Marathon." And just the profundity of that moment to realize we are all called to this space of remembering and holding these stories so our nation doesn't forget, and recognizing that we're not the only ones doing this work, but we've got brothers and sisters across the country who have been called to care for these heavy national stories.
I never thought I'd be doing what I'm doing now. I used to be a business journalist for the Wall Street Journal covering Apple and Steve Jobs. But I'm just astonished by, there are all these people in the, in the past in my life, from college, from work, from different stages, that are coming back into, intersecting with what I'm doing. And it might be that, they told, sharing a story about incarceration in their family, supporting us, regardless, doing this work, and it's, friends of friends. And it just really drives home to me how prevalent it is and how we really are all connected. And so, it's just, past people in my life.
Last one. Okay. All right. Last question. So I'm going to read kind of the last part of this question, which I think is the key. What is your vision of our world, say 7 generations from now? And what is the joy that allows you to kind of remain committed to this vision despite everything?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a world built around healing, a world without prisons, without the carceral state at all. So no police, no prisons, no ICE, no none of this. It's certainly a world with an alternative framework to capitalism. We can engage on what that is. I feel an affinity towards democratic socialism, but for me, I think it remains to be seen what imagination we can have about what that framework is, but capitalism is not working for us. It's working for like 7 people, and that's it. And if we're being real, like, it's not even capitalism anymore. It's just basically oligarchy, you know what I mean? But still, they're calling it that, so we got to get rid of that. I think to me, it's a world that's also a lot more localized. I think that globalization is a little bit of a trick. There's a lot of good things that have certainly come out of it, including obviously global solidarity, which is important, and also the sharing of many things. But I think it has also made global wage theft and domination much easier. And it has also made tech conglomeration much easier. I think that it also disperses our power, and our power always has to start locally. And I also think it's very hard to build communities globally in the same way that you can build them locally in terms of taking care of people. So I envision a global world and a global community that is engaged in that is committed to a world of sharing, where everybody has what they need, not only to live with health, but also to thrive. And that's obviously our basic needs, but also like everything else that one deserves. But I also think it's one where we're in relationship globally, but where we are governing locally, and where we are led by deep community engaged processes, where we really understand how to practice community over individualism. And I think that's a little bit of it's the combination of a different practical economic and governance system, but alongside an actual like mental and spiritual rebirth. Yeah.
For me, it's pretty simple. It's a word where everybody matters.
Yeah, yes, to everything that you want to say, yes. I guess I have a few hopes. One hope is that people have and maintain a PBS Kids imagination. Like, I want people to be able to dream and to chase after those dreams. I also want people to be able to get back to our roots that our indigenous brothers and sisters teach us about being in relationship to the earth, and the earth being our relative, and that we're living more sustainably, and we're not over consuming, but we are content with enough. And then because of the work that I do, I imagine, and I tell my team this, and I tell my people this, so I imagine that we are able to build a museum that houses the story of protests from 2020 onward, that houses the stories of those lives that were lynched unjustly. And people look back and they would see us and they would say, wow, like those people fought for us. My hope is that we can preserve our stories well enough and as close to the truth enough that our descendants will have hope for themselves because they saw the hope that we have for their generations.
That's really inspiring visions of the future. I hope that everyone websites, you can read about PJP. You can read what the writers are writing. Samora's website, Healing Project. You can see a lot of performances, hear amazing music, and read wonderful writing. And rise and remember, I don't know if there's an exhibition, there may not be an exhibition here anytime soon, but check out the website, and when you are next in Minneapolis, go. But now, please join me in thanking Jeanelle Austin, Yukari Kane, and Samora Pinderhughes.